In the summer of 1945, something happened at a military parade in Berlin that genuinely frightened the most senior military commanders of every major Western power simultaneously. And the thing that frightened them was not a weapon they had never seen before, in the abstract sense, but rather the sudden and visceral realization that everything they thought they knew about tank warfare, everything they had learned through 5 years of brutal combat across Europe and North Africa, was potentially obsolete in a single afternoon. What rolled through the streets of Berlin that day was a Soviet heavy tank designated the IS-3, and the men watching it from the reviewing stands, American generals, British field marshals, French commanders, looked at its extraordinary low silhouette, its massive pike-shaped nose, and its enormous 122mm gun, and understood immediately that none of the tanks in their arsenals at that moment could deal with what they were looking at on anything like equal terms, and that the implications of that fact for the emerging confrontation between the Western powers and the Soviet Union were going to be very serious indeed. The IS-3 did not appear from nowhere, and to understand why it was so shocking to the Western observers who saw it for the first time in Berlin, you need to understand the context from which it emerged, because the Soviet tank design philosophy of the Second World War was shaped by experiences so brutal and so costly that they produced a kind of engineering ruthlessness that Western designers simply did not share. A willingness to sacrifice everything that was not absolutely essential to the core mission of killing enemy tanks and surviving long enough to kill more of them. The Soviet Union lost an almost incomprehensible number of tanks during the war, particularly in the catastrophic early period following the German invasion in June 1941, when entire armored formations were destroyed, not because Soviet tanks were necessarily inferior in every technical respect, but because of failures of doctrine, training, communication, and leadership that left even good equipment unable to perform effectively in combat, and the lessons learned from those catastrophic losses were absorbed with an intensity that fundamentally shaped everything that came out of Soviet tank design shops for the next decade. The IS designation stood for Iosif Stalin, which tells you something important about the political context in which these tanks were developed, because naming your heavy tank program after the supreme leader of the state was not simply a gesture of flattery, but a signal that the program had the highest possible priority and the full backing of the most powerful man in the country, which in the Soviet system of the 1940s meant that resources, engineering talent, and manufacturing capacity would flow to the program in quantities that other projects could only dream of. The IS series began with the IS-1 and IS-2, both of which were formidable machines that had already demonstrated their effectiveness in combat against the best German armor, with the IS-2 in particular proving capable of destroying Tiger and Panther tanks at combat ranges that gave Soviet crews a genuine tactical advantage. But the designers at the Chelyabinsk tank factory, known as Tankograd, Tank City, were already working on something that went significantly beyond what either of those vehicles represented. The IS-3 was the product of a specific set of lessons drawn from the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, where Soviet armor had suffered enormous losses, partly because the frontal armor of existing Soviet tanks, while reasonably thick in absolute terms, was mounted at angles that did not maximize its effectiveness against incoming fire. And the designers who studied the wreckage of Soviet tanks destroyed at Kursk noticed a pattern that would fundamentally reshape their approach to armored protection. What they observed was that a disproportionate number of kills were being achieved by shells striking the upper front hull and the turret front, and that the flat or moderately angled surfaces in those areas were not deflecting incoming rounds effectively, even when the armor was nominally thick enough to stop them, because a shell striking a relatively flat surface transfers its energy much more efficiently than one striking a highly angled surface, where much of the energy is redirected rather than absorbed. The solution they developed was radical and immediately recognizable the moment you see it: a pike-shaped nose formed by two large angled plates meeting at a sharp central ridge, creating a surface so acutely angled that shells striking it from the front were deflected with extraordinary consistency, and a hemispherical turret so smoothly curved that it presented no flat surfaces anywhere for incoming fire to strike cleanly. The result was a tank that offered protection levels that were genuinely remarkable for its time, despite not being dramatically heavier than its predecessors, because the genius of the IS-3 design was not brute thickness of armor, but the sophisticated use of angle and shape. To make the armor, it had work far more effectively than any straightforward measurement of millimeter thickness would suggest. When Western engineers and military analysts eventually got their hands on detailed specifications and were able to run the calculations properly, the numbers they arrived at were deeply uncomfortable, because the effective frontal protection of the IS-3 against the standard anti-tank weapons in the Western arsenal at the end of the war was sufficient to defeat essentially all of them at any combat range that a tank crew would realistically encounter in the European theater, which meant that the tanks NATO was planning to field in the early Cold War period were potentially outclassed before they had even entered service. The 122mm gun that the IS-3 carried was another source of serious concern for Western planners, because while it had a slower rate of fire than the guns fitted to Western tanks of the same period due to the two-piece ammunition it used, the projectile it fired was so large and so energetic that it could penetrate the armor of any Western tank then in service or planned for service at ranges that gave Soviet crews a significant tactical advantage. And the combination of a gun that could kill anything it faced and armor that nothing in the Western arsenal could reliably penetrate at combat ranges added up to a threat assessment that was genuinely alarming for the military establishments of every NATO country. Emergency programs were launched almost immediately after the Berlin Parade, with the Americans accelerating work on what would become the M103 heavy tank, the British pushing forward with the Conqueror, and virtually every NATO member frantically reassessing its armored warfare doctrine to account for the possibility of facing large numbers of IS-3s in a future European conflict, which was at that point considered by many senior military planners to be a genuine and near-term possibility rather than a distant hypothetical. What made the situation even more concerning for Western planners was the sheer number of IS-3s that the Soviet Union had produced and was continuing to produce, because unlike the German heavy tanks of the Second World War, which had been built in relatively small numbers due to their complexity and the manufacturing constraints of a country under constant air attack and resource pressure, the Soviet industrial machine was capable of turning out heavy tanks in quantities that could potentially overwhelm any qualitative advantage that Western designers managed to develop, and the memory of Soviet industrial output during the war, when factories relocated east of the Ural Mountains had produced tanks in numbers that had genuinely stunned German planners, gave Western military establishments very little comfort when they tried to game out the scenarios for a conventional conflict in Central Europe. The IS-3 saw its first actual combat not against NATO forces in the hypothetical European war that Cold War planners spent so much time preparing for, but rather in the Middle East, when Egypt deployed a number of IS-3s during the Suez Crisis of 1956, and then again in larger numbers during the Six-Day War of 1967. And the performance of the tank in those conflicts provided the first real operational data about how it performed against modern anti-tank weapons and against the Israeli armor that it faced in the Sinai Desert. The results were instructive in ways that both confirmed and complicated the assessments that Western analysts had been making since 1945, because the IS-3 proved that its armor protection was genuinely formidable against many weapon systems, but also revealed operational and mechanical limitations that had been difficult to assess from the outside, including a cramped interior that made crew performance degrade significantly over extended operations, a loading system for the main gun that was physically demanding enough to slow the rate of fire below theoretical levels in sustained combat, and maintenance requirements that strained the logistical capabilities of armies that had not been trained specifically to operate the vehicle. By the time the IS-3s in Egyptian service were destroyed or captured by Israeli forces in 1967, the tank had already been largely superseded in Soviet service by more modern designs. But its legacy, in terms of what it had forced Western designers and military planners to do, was permanent and irreversible, because the panic that it had generated in 1945 had fundamentally reshaped the entire trajectory of Western tank development for at least 2 decades and had introduced design principles: the use of highly angled and shaped armor, the prioritization of low silhouette, the acceptance of crew discomfort as a price worth paying for improved protection. That influenced tank design on both sides of the Cold War divide for generations. Every modern tank you see today, with its sloped armor and carefully calculated angles, carries within its design the intellectual DNA of the lessons that Soviet engineers drew from the wreckage at Kursk and built into the extraordinary machine that rolled through Berlin in the summer of 1945 and frightened an entire alliance into rethinking everything it knew about armored warfare. The IS-3 never fired a shot in anger against the NATO forces it was designed and built to destroy, and the war it was prepared for never came. But its influence on the world we live in today is nonetheless real and profound, because the arms race it triggered, the programs it accelerated, and the thinking it forced upon Western military establishments shaped the development of military technology and Cold War strategy in ways that are still visible if you know where to look. And the pike-nose silhouette that caused such consternation on the reviewing stands in Berlin remains one of the most recognizable and, in its own way, most beautiful shapes in the entire history of armored vehicle design. A monument to the brutal engineering logic of a country that had learned its lessons about tank warfare at a cost measured in millions of lives, and was absolutely determined that it would never have to learn them again.